afternoon. I'm Anno Saxenian, and pleased to welcome all of you from the iSchool and also from other parts of campus. I recognize lots of faces from different places, and it's always great to have a speaker that draws people from outside of this building. I'm pleased to welcome Jane Greenberg. Jane is a professor at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC Chapel Hill, and she's director of their Metadata Research Center. She also holds posts as a senior scientist at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center in Durham, North Carolina, and as a 2014 data fellow at the National Consortium for Data Science in affiliation with the Renaissance Computing Institute in Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching foci are in the areas of metadata, knowledge organization, data science, and the semantic web, linked data and linked data. And she's received funding support from the NSF, IMLS, NIH, acronym soup here, OCLC, Microsoft Research, the Library of Commerce, and the UNC Research Council. She's also, and I think she'll speak to us about this, she's a principal investigator of Hive, which stands for the Helping Interdisciplinary Vocabulary Engineering Initiative, Dynamic Linked Data Ontology Application. And she's also co-principal investigator on the Dryad Data Repository Project, which she may or may not explain to us today.
I will.
She will. She's also co-chair of the Research Data Alliance Metadata Standards Directory Working Group, co-lead of the Dublin Core Science and Metadata Community, co-lead of the Data One Metadata and Preservation Working Group, and vice chair of the CODATA Data at Risk Working Group. As you can see, she's definitely got her fingers in a lot of really important, interesting stuff. She's received many awards for her research, including the Mann Citation, the Jesse H. Shira Award for Distinguished Published Research, a SEM Search Best Paper Award at the International W3C Conference, and the Frederick G. Kilgore Award for Research in Library and Information Technology. And last but not least, she was awarded a Catedrática de Excelencia, a Chair of Excellence, at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, Spain. And so she and her husband and children enjoyed life in Spain during that time. Jane is going to speak to us today about advancing cyber infrastructure through metadata research. She says to me that she's looking forward to the Q&A section. Would ask that people interrupt only if they have questions, urgent questions of clarification, and save the substantive questions for afterwards so she can get through her content. Please join me in welcoming Jane Greenberg.
There are tools that allow for interoperability and sharing of metadata, but in many environments, there are people creating the same metadata over and over on a daily basis. And this is where the Dryad project comes in. So I'm curious how many people have heard of Dryad. I know maybe a few of you have. Anybody deposit data in Dryad here? No? I have. I have, and it's been downloaded. It's kind of exciting. So Dryad is a repository for data underlying published research. And it started out in the evolutionary sciences, evolutionary biology. And it was created to allow for data preservation, data sharing, data reuse, and repurposing of data, and also to validate findings. Starting out in evolutionary biology was somewhat strategic. If you think about the field of evolutionary biology, scientists need to depend on data that other scientists had collected long ago. And the initiative started between a partnership between NESCENT, which was already mentioned. That's the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center. That's a collaboration between UNC, NC State, and Duke, and the Metadata Research Center that I direct. And it was kind of exciting for me. I had two evolutionary biologists track me down and say, we need to build a data repository, and we think we need metadata on it, and do you know about standards? Do you know what the Dublin Core is? And can you help us? And I said, yes, this sounds exciting. And in forming the partnership, they also said to me, we don't want to just build this. We actually want to evaluate it along the way. You know, they wanted a research project. So since 2006, when we had these initial meetings, we've been working on it. And We had our first set of funding, good funding from NSF in 2007, and then another grant. So it is supported by NSF, but the repository project is also now charging a fee, and we've made $60,000 to $70,000, and it has to become self-sustainable. All right, going to get to the research, but if nothing else, if you can think about Dryad and remember this image, it's about data sharing, and I sometimes joke, data sharing across species, but let me show you a little bit about the workflow in Dryad. It's integrated, the data publication is integrated with the actual publication process. So think about your own research that you publish in an article, and you may have some presentation of data. You may have a table, a graph, or something. Dryad takes the data, wants the data underlying that publication part. So yeah, Excel spreadsheets, Nexus files, those kinds of information. So the vanilla workflow is to the author's at the top, right, with that star. To the left, there's a blue circle. And so a scientist submits an article for peer review, and either it's rejected or yes, your article is accepted, and please make these modifications or major revisions, so forth. But before you send your final article back, go put your data into Dryad. And while there are no police out there, making sure that the scientists do this, the editors of partner journals are follow up and make sure. And so there are 45 journals that have now come on board, and they have signed what's called a joint data archiving policy to pool their resources and make sure that happens. So the red is when the scientist or the person depositing, could be a graduate student or so forth, goes to the repository and puts the data in, and the curator looks over the metadata associated with it. And at that time, a DOI, a digital object identifier, is minted. And we actually work with the California Digital Library, credit to John there, and the EasyID that allows the DOI to come back for the data package associated with the article. And that's what goes on to the published article. Just to give you a little bit of statistics, we have about 50 deposits a week, 50 to 60. And I already mentioned the joint data archiving policy. So the data package is at the top. So one data package is associated with each article or each publication, but it can have many data files. And what's interesting is the number of downloads. Now, we're tracking this, and downloads don't necessarily mean reuse, but there are, doing pretty well there with interesting downloads. I'll speak more to that in a little bit. The Dryad project is also part of the Data One DataNet, helping to build Cyberinfrastructure, and just become a member node. Okay, so research questions. Back to that observation about there's a lot of metadata that's being created over and over again and doesn't need to be. In thinking about the Dryad's workflow, the question is to look at metadata reuse in the workflow. So I gave you the vanilla workflow, and what happens when the scientist comes to deposit their data, we parse bibliographic metadata associated with the article and pre-populate a template so that the scientist doesn't have to start from scratch in creating metadata about their data. I mean, we want to make it as easy as possible and trying to automate that workflow. But they do have to create some metadata. So the question is, where is metadata reuse most common in Dryad, and where is it not happening so we can improve that? How might the workflow be improved and modified? And this relates to some of my, or has inspired some of my work on Metadata Capital, which I'll comment on. So I mentioned the vanilla workflow where it's integrated in the publication process. And there are 45 journals that do that. But back in my statistics, I guess, there are 306 journals represented. So what's happening there is a scientist goes through the process and gets kind of excited. We call people our pet depositors. So what they do is, they've done it with a Dryad partner journal, but then another workflow is that they can go and find other articles of theirs that are published and get their data that they have, maybe it's on their hard drive, and they can submit that data to Dryad and still get a DOI. And so the number of journals being represented is increasing. And there are other workflows. Some journals don't want us to publish the data till the article comes out and so forth, and it gets a little complicated. So the two that I just explained, the vanilla workflow and the one, I call it the pet depositor workflow, make up about 65 to 70% of our weekly deposits. And what we did in this study, and I should say I'm using the word we in this research project, the other ones, and they're research efforts that I've led, but I have students working on them and their team efforts, so it's kind of a royal we. We pulled a sample from the two workflows and looked at broken down by instantiations about when the scientist does a little bit of the curation, when the curator comes on board, and what's happening. And we had 20 cases, 100 instantiations, looking at 609 metadata properties over time, capturing them in the workflow, archiving them, flagging the different kinds of changes that were happening in the workflow with Dryad. So is metadata being added and enriched? Is it being deleted from the initial parsing? Is it being modified? And where is the metadata coming in the workflow that it's just being reused? So there's like a good, from the beginning, that metadata is good quality. There's no cost. It just keeps moving through the life cycle. And here is one of a graph from it. And this is for the first phase with just the scientists and where they're doing work and where they don't have to do any work, because there's metadata reuse is good enough. And so a way that you can look at this is green is good, red is costly. It's time that the scientist has to spend creating metadata. Yellow's a little bit of effort, and blue, there's only one deletion in the sample. So the basic descriptive kinds of metadata, thank goodness we're getting it right. Things like author and subject and stuff coming from the initial workflow. But things like spatial information, taxonomic, scientific taxonomic name, and geolocation, there's effort being put there by the scientist, and that's time consuming. So this is another table looking at the phase one with the scientist or depositor, and then the curator coming and moving on. So we've got the green to the green and the red to the kind of deeper red, and the yellow to the orange in terms of looking at parallels. So it's the same kind of thing. Green is good. It's no effort. It's just going through the workflow. And red is where there's more work being done. And so if you just look at scientific taxonomic name, it's less of a cost for the curator because they're having the scientists do the work, and they're pretty happy with that. And so there's some green there, but there's a little bit of effort. And so the idea is that where there's red is really where we should be putting our efforts and looking to do more automatic processing and making that better so that the depositors, we want low barriers, we want to move it through and having them get it done. So I don't know if I mentioned, but the curation happens in the Metadata Research Center at SILS, and about 95% of it happens there. So this is a daily activity. Again, we're with the same color scheme because I think it's the best way to give you a view. So nearly all of the metadata at least has some 50% or more of reuse. So that's we're doing okay. And the basic sort of bibliographic properties are low cost, but the more complex as kinds of metadata, things like scientific name and taxon and temporal is where we really, again, I mentioned, need to be putting our efforts. And so the conclusion here is areas for improving the workflows would be focusing on those more complex properties. And the Hive project is the next project I'll talk about. And that's where some of that is going. So this kind of research has been going on for a while. This is one where it's just the email to the metadata, the initial package, and this is an earlier study. It's a little more data. So again, it's kind of the green is good, red is bad. So I've been watching this. But what's happening here in this earlier study is this is the metadata from the package level down to the individual files. So, and you see more blue here because individual files associated with a publication are not fully inclusive of everything in a publication. So they wouldn't inherit everything. So there's a little bit of deletion going on. So some conclusions then. Generating quality metadata at the time of the initial creation is paramount. And there's a sweet spot that we need to keep working on. Things happen from the initial deposit and the actual publication, like the article title might change or the abstract might change. And so we're using the initial information that comes in during the peer review. The studies are limited in some ways in the size and the cases, although we looked at the most common kinds of cases in Dryad. The whole idea of metadata reuse is really nothing new. It's being looked at in many different environments. And so it has been an inspiration for me to look at this metadata capital work. The methodology shared here provides a framework and a baseline for some future work. Final comment about Dryad is this project has, as I said, started in 2006 and been going since initial funding in 2007, and had a lot of students working on the project and a lot of research studies, master's papers. The students who end up being assistant curators often want to do independent studies. We've had a dissertation on the work. And so these are just some of the kinds of studies that have been done: cognitive workthroughs, crosswalk analysis, quantitative categorical analysis of metadata properties, and so forth. So just there for your viewing. And that stuff is, if you want to know more about it, happy to talk more. Okay, moving on to the next project, research project. So as I said, I wanted to start each one with an observation. So, you know, I haven't quite drank the linked data Kool-Aid acid, but you know, I'm interested in linked data and the semantic web, and some of my work is in that area. And there are interesting questions there about where is the best place to pursue linked data. I think it gets a little scary when in the linked data environment where the metadata becomes so much larger than the thing itself. And there's a lot of cost and investment in it. And so thinking about the most intelligent way that we should pursue linked data is a question that greatly interests me. And my observation is that the greatest potential in linked open data may be in the area of linked open vocabularies. So there's a concept going around called love. And so I love linked data, right? All right, Hive. So it was introduced before. It stands for Helping Interdisciplinary Vocabulary Engineering. And Dryad was one of the inspirations for the Hive initiative. But we can just think about any digital library or data archive that often one ontology or one terminology is not enough. That you need multiple kinds of terminologies or multiple vocabularies. So I go back to Dryad and even its narrowest focus, which was evolutionary biology, that in itself is very interdisciplinary. You've got ecology, paleontology, genetics, and so forth. So thinking about one ontology there is not going to work. In addition to things like geolocation, taxonomic name, temporal information. So if we could think about a way to take advantage of semantic web technologies and bring terminologies together, that would have some benefit. And it's one thing, people are putting terminologies and vocabularies on the web in digital format constantly, you know, but I mean, come on, sometimes I see somebody puts their vocabulary up and it's in a Word document. It's one thing to put it on the web and make it accessible. It's another thing to really make it for the web. And this is where the linked data comes into play. So the other thing is just to maybe refer back to Dryad, recognizing that there was no one vocabulary in evolutionary biology was one thing. Was the Dryad project in a position to take on creating the evolutionary biology vocabulary? No way. You know, creating and maintaining an ontology is a big cost effort, and there are terminologies that are created and maintained by our national agencies, international agencies, and as they are published more and more in linked data, and particularly in SCOS and OWL, these standards, it's a way to take advantage of them. So the Hive project was launched with an initial grant from IMLS, and now has support from NSF and is being explored in the DataOne DataNet and actually integrated into the DFC, the DataNet Federation Consortium. And you can think about a little bee going out to the different terminologies at the time of indexing and bringing the right concepts back to the Hive for, in this case, data sets. To justify the initial grant, we did a study where we looked at a number of partner journals in the Dryad repository and extracted the keywords. Then we put the keywords into facets. We had 10 different facets: taxon, geographic name, time period, topical, and then did mapping to a series of selected vocabularies. And what we found is that, you know, somewhere between 18 to 25% of the vocabularies we were looking at were good for Dryad, but no one vocabulary. Just to take you to a scenario and then say a little bit more about some of the research. This is how it operates. So Amy Zane is a botanist, and she publishes, and like a good botanist, she puts her data into Dryad. And in doing so, she could work with Hive, and so she takes the text, or through an automatic processing, takes the abstract to her article and processes. And this is the kind of thing that comes back, a tag cloud. Now, the initial grant where this comes from was a demonstration grant. And the Hive algorithm it involves some machine learning. We used initially Kia and then moved to Maui, which is, comes out of Waikato University. And it was originally trained on agricultural documents. So if you look at this, some of these concepts, especially the ones coming from the biocomplexity thesaurus, they're pretty good terms. Associated species, traits, genetics. And then the ones come from Library of Congress, not so good. Not published, but there's one here, Al Murphy, fictitious character, not so good. But you know, thinking about this, is it easier for the scientists to click on which terms are good representation or which ones aren't? I have some thoughts on that. I think it's probably easier for people to say what's not relevant than what is relevant. They'd be more efficient. So there's a Hive demonstration system at Nescent, and a Hive prototype in Dryad. But the software is all open source, and the code, and what we found out in moving forward with the initial projects is people were using it. People were coming to it and using the demonstration project on a daily basis and telling me, I'm like, no, that's just a demo. So, but some people have actually come sort of stepped up to the plate and contributed to it. So the LTER, Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which are about 50 hubs internationally, they actually use an instance of Hive every day. And in their Hive, they have their own selection of vocabularies. They have a USGS thesaurus and one of their own terminologies. The DataNet Federation Consortium is now using have an instance of Hive in their workflow. And we know from other people that have contacted us that there's been other experimentation. The Library of Congress Minerva project, the Smithsonian Field Notebook project. I've heard from people in Norway and also in Italy about experimenting with Hive. In terms of the architecture, this is just an overview. There are two main things. You can search whatever vocabularies you put into your Hive, and then you can do the automatic processing. I already mentioned Kia Maui, the Hive software combines several open source technologies. It's Java-based, run on a Java application server. And the code was originally in Google Code, and through the current project with the DFC, the DataNet Federation Consortium, we're moving it to GitHub. Okay, so research questions here. Similar to the Dryad project, there's been a lot of student involvement, a lot of projects, master's papers, and so forth. So the one to report on here is, can automatic indexing techniques such as those supported by Hive, drawing on love, linked open vocabularies, improve inter-indexer consistency? And so Hive itself had these different phases, the initial project where we built the Hive, taught about Hive, and then evaluated the Hive. And in teaching about it, we had a series of workshops that we conducted, and in those workshops, we did a little bit of testing. You know, we followed IRB and so forth. And we had people with two scenarios of Dryad data sets and publications look at them and go through a process where first they would read the article and look at the data set and assign keywords off the top of their head. And then second, they would work with the Hive and select the demo system. We actually installed a special test system and assign the run the processor and get a cluster of terms. And then thirdly, they would select the relevant terms. So we had, in the end, we had 62 cases and small 188 terms, but we started to look at this and look at inter-indexer consistency in using this. And here, looking with the rolling measure, this is consistency, not necessarily relevancy, but the top one is with Hive and relevance, and the bottom one is just free text. And we found that, you know, of course, when presented with a smaller selection of terms generated automatically, the selection of terms, the consistency goes up. And that was significant. We did some various t-tests. And here is just the looking at the consistency for the three terminologies used in this test, the thesaurus of geographic names, the LCSH, and the USGS biocomplexity thesaurus. So from an initial approach where the scientists are just asked, you know, read this, assign your keywords, to when they're asked, you know, go to the Hive and select some vocabularies. And they didn't all always select exactly the same vocabularies. We let them run freely, but then select relevant terms from what you get. We had an increase of 21%, 21.61%, you know, 22% almost, in consistency. That's kind of nice. So conclusions here is that Hive is successful with consistency and may inform new workflows. Inter-indexer consistency alone is not a measure of quality. So, you know, you can be consistently bad. You know, if I looked at the other one, the earlier diagram, non-relevant, the consistency increases. It's not significant, but, you know, it's consistency alone. So thinking about other measures like specificity and exhaustivity. You know, this is, Hive is I want to say a little stupid. It doesn't, it pulls in these different terminologies, but it doesn't go the full, you know, 9 yards to do semantic interoperability between each of the individual vocabularies. And in some ways, we think that's part of the success. It allows for the interaction with the human, you know, the quick clicking. And so we can say that it can at least reduce the burden. Perhaps the most important is that there's value in tools that can help contribute to consistency in indexing or assignment of metadata across different skill levels and experience. So our participants were mainly scientists and informatics folks that don't deal with metadata day to day, don't do standards, don't want to work with them, and so yet we could leverage their knowledge. So already was mentioned Spain, so I have to take a minute to show you Spain. Part of my work in Spain as a Cátedra de Excellence was with the National Library of Spain and the University Carlos III, and we implemented Hive ES and had one of our workshops. And the picture on the right is actually after we got the Hive ES launched, Hive España, and we worked with the Library of Congress vocabulary that's in Spanish, a learning terminology, and the Spanish being who they are. Of course, we worked with a wine vocabulary, and that's the example. And this picture actually is taken in the National Library after we had a glass of wine. It's a little blurry. It's the only picture I have. If we have time, you can ask me about the logo. It's an interesting story, but the bees apparently really bothered the Spanish on the original, and they wanted a bunch of bulls around the hive. So I'm going to keep going. Bob, thinking about you, I did take chapter 1 of the discipline of organizing and put it through the Hive Generator. And remember now, it's been trained on Agravoc, this system that I tested it with. And Agravoc does really nice, even though it's an agricultural vocabulary coming from the the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. So you've got organization, classification, information services, and so forth. The Library of Congress does terribly. But also the mesh vocabulary does kind of nicely. Yeah. So you've got software, library science, search engines, ecosystems, and also the USGS vocabulary does quite nicely. And okay. Paying attention to time. Last area or last observation is about conceptual models. There are no shortage of conceptual models out there, and particularly in metadata. But conceptual models are important. They help us frameworks, they're guidelines, they're not laws. They can help us understand relationships amongst entities. So the observation is conceptual models can improve or can provide useful frameworks, although they are often conceived and implemented without adequate end-user assessment or empirical analyses. And so I already mentioned the stuff on the left about guidelines, and on the right is just a small collection of what you might call resource description models or metadata models, and there are no shortage of these kinds of models out there. So in this area, the work I'm sharing is really sort of pilot work, but I'm interested in what you might think of in terms of the relationships between data sets and how they're reused over time. What happens from data set one when it's published to then it's reused? How is it modified? Does it become a whole part? Is it a derivative? What happens if somebody adds to it? And Dryad has been a place to think about this and do some testing, or has inspired some testing. Just to pull back from Dryad, that Amy Zane research set, what you've seen there is the circle around the number of times that data set has been downloaded. And the downloads don't necessarily mean reuse, okay? But we actually have tracked at least over 100 cases of reuse and publication of her data. And so even though it's been downloaded over 9,000 times. So I said I put my own data in Dryad, and I put my data in there related to the first study I talked about. I put it in toward the end of last year. And so I'm kind of excited that that data's been downloaded. It doesn't mean that somebody's reusing it yet. I mean, I haven't found any instances. I would be delighted to find that. But if somebody were to reuse my data, or I want to know, like, what did they do to it? Did they add to it? You know, did they take away from it? And so the question here is, sorry about that. I wasn't expecting that. Okay. Is back to the scientific data sets and all this effort coming from NSF and NLM, or NIH, sorry, about data reuse and mandates. Is do scientists think about data as a first-class object? Are they able to understand the difference between instantiations of a data set over the lifetime? And so the study run here was an instantiation comprehension test, and the participants were scientists engaged in research and publication. So we had 20 scientists read and understand these relationships, and this was one of the diagrams we gave them. We only tested these 4 relationships: equivalence, derivative, whole part, and sequential. And they had descriptions of them and spent a bit of time. We paid them to think about this and look at them, and then ask them if they were comfortable with understanding these relationships. They had, each participant looked at eight scenarios. So in the end, there was 160 cases where they had to identify what that relationship is. And then also a follow-up survey was done. So here's this is one of the simplest scenarios. So they were given. I said each scientist had 8. Sherry collects data on the survival and growth of the plant, and I'm not going to say it, but the bushy seaside tansy, and then, actually I couldn't fit it all in here because these scenarios are somewhat long, but it says back at the lab she copies the exact set of data that she took out in the field into an Excel spreadsheet, and what is the relationship between Sherry's paper data sheet and the Excel spreadsheet. And this one's pretty clear-cut, hopefully. You would all answer equivalent. So those were the cases. And as I said, this is kind of piloting and thinking about this work, and did scientists understand it? So with the 160 cases we have now, so scientists can grasp those relationships. What we found is that the sequential was most difficult at this point, and I'm careful in saying this because the sample's small, but the less seasoned scientists had more difficulty in grasping the sequential. And so you could say, oh, well, it's because they haven't been around, but it could be the way those scenarios were worded. We worked with scientists that are affiliated with Dryad to create the scenarios. In the follow-up survey, asking them, do you think it's important to record this kind of information, the kinds of relationships, derivative, whole part, sequential, and yes, is unanimous support. So a conclusion is that relationships are important. They're important to applicable to data objects. This kind of taxonomy, if you would say, about understanding the different kinds of relationships. So next step, I want to redo this. I want a larger, more diverse population. There are other relationships out there that people have defined, such as aggregate relationships, part-to-part kind of relationships about data sets, is referenced by references, and thinking about testing, how could we do that? I mean, this was a lot of time to just do these 20 people and make sure they sat down and read. Very generous. One of the things about Dryad and working with Nessun is I get these scientists who are willing to participate, and that's good. But getting a larger population. Sort of the end goal is there's no way I think you could expect a scientist when they're reusing a data set to say, okay, I've reused it, now I'm going to put it back in Dryad or another repository. And by the way, this relationship is a derivative, or this relation is a whole part. They're not going to do it. But what kind of application, how could this be tracked automatically? How could we develop a way to capture this? And I've looked a little bit at the PROV model, the provenance model that's come out of the W3C. And there's a little bit of work in there that could perhaps come into some kind of system. What can I say? I need to do more work in the area, and I'm excited about the potential of this kind of work. Okay, so I've gone through 3 studies, and if you remember my original overview, I said I wanted to say something about some nascent work and then comment briefly on iOrg. So we're doing just fine with time. And one of my newest projects, and is really just getting started, is called the Metadata Capital Initiative. And you know, we think about capital, we often think about it in terms of financial kind of stuff that we hold on to. You know, it's an economic concept. Think back to Max Weber and Adam Smith. It's often discussed in the business and operations literature about net gains and losses, and so I already mentioned finances. But capital is also spoken about in terms of goods and services and needs, and we even have scholars who've defined things like intellectual capital, the sharing of knowledge, or social capital, your network, organizational or personal. And you know, one of the higher level commonalities of all these definitions or interpretations of capital is that it's a tangible result that has value, and that value can increase or decrease. So I've been thinking about this in the context of metadata, and metadata as a product, and thinking about the early work with Dryad that I presented about the metadata reuse. And could we say that good quality metadata being reused over time shows an increase in value? And I have to say, I gave a presentation on this at ACES this fall, the SIG Classification Research Group, and I had, you know, like a little smiley face sweating, and then this show Friends, you know, I had a picture of the Friends people and say, you know, I'm a little outside my element, you know, I was a little nervous, I'm just toying with this idea, but I think it has a hook, and also, you know, metadata is kind of in now, thanks to Snowden. So I've mentioned to a few people, my 80-year-old father now says to me, "Is metadata? I saw it in the Wall Street Journal. You know, that's what you study, right? You know, now it's okay. Now it's okay." But so through this, I have the 1-year data science fellowship. I have 2 projects where we're really at the very beginning stage of trying to define how can we study this. How can we begin to quantify perhaps cost and value? And one is with RTI International. That's a research institute in the Research Triangle Park, and they deal a lot with health and health information, global health. And so we are moving forward to look at SGHI, self-generated health information. So you can think if, you know, you have a Fitbit, and that data that you capture, and metadata, to make that, you know, the data is only as good as the metadata, that people want it, industry wants it, other people want it, and so the value of that in it being reused. So we're starting that, and the other is with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. I have a long history of working with these folks, and they don't want to use Hive. They want to actually go and build their own terminology in environmental health sciences. And so the thinking about a concept and the value of a concept over time if it's reused in a linked data way is where we are starting with that partner. And I'm working with, I should acknowledge, Tom Caruso for RTI and Becky Boyles at NIEHS. And right now we have this modified capital sigma notation that is incremental increase over reuse, and another is a summation, what's it called, this successive growth rate, summation equation. And you could think about a concept or a data set or something that has popularity, increase, and then it's kind of heydays over and it goes back down. So as I said, nascent work just getting launched. The other project I want to mention comes out of the Data One community, and it was mentioned that I co-lead it's called PAM, Preservation and Metadata Working Group, and just so happens that John Quincy is here, who is co-chair, I'm co-chair with on that working group. And that metadata muscle image I had, if you can remember that, sort of empowerment and owning your metadata is part of the hook for me. But it's also the standards process. If you've ever been in any kind of standards activity, particularly metadata standards, they can be brutal. People get really passionate. There's the loudest person in the room, and it takes a long time. It can be quite painful. So one of the things that we have really talked about and thought about is that the whole standards process hasn't taken advantage of social technology. And so this project called the Meta Dictionary, or also we now call it YAMS, yet another metadata zoo, is been launched through the Data One initiative. It's in Python and off-the-shelf tools and so forth. You can read about the technology there. And I should credit Christopher Patton, who we were really lucky to, through the Data One project, get a summer intern to help build this initial prototype. And it is using sort of the thumbs up, thumbs down in terms of thinking about a term and a standard and trying to get communities involved. And the idea is that strong terms will rise to the top, and lesser agreed upon terms in metadata standards would go to the bottom. Some of you may be familiar with Stack Overflow, and that was one of the inspirations. So it's Heroku is where it is, and anybody can log in with a Gmail account and can try it. And this is just a quick capture of some of the ranking and voting down in terms, and you can get in there and sort of put your term or put a series of terms for a metadata standard, and comment yes and no. And so thinking about the algorithm behind there is something we're moving forward on now. But good terms that get endorsed can be considered canonical. Bad terms people just tear apart, come deprecate it. And so, John, yes, your name is in there on this one. Sorry. The initial implementation of a term is vernacular. And this is just one screenshot. One of the things that we've noticed with our project is in the Research Data Alliance, there's a data foundations terminology group, and there are some active people from that community that have gotten in there, and they're been trying to work out some definitions of their terms. And the other is in the Data One community. There's a working group called PPSR, Public Participants in Scientific Research. And they've used this to start to work out some of their terms. We've been trying to get a student involved to help us with evaluation. Okay, so final section here. The IOR, Information Organization hook, or the metadata hook, and just a few quick notes about the Metadata Research Center, since it has served as a hub for bringing my research projects together and mustering support and so forth. So the center itself was established in 2006, 2007, and in 2011 we celebrated the 5th year anniversary. I launched it because, information organization or metadata is something that people know you have to do, but not everyone wants to study it or do it. It's kind of like, tell me what standard I should use, just tell me what I should do. And I'm quite passionate about, fine, I'll tell you, but we should research it and make sure we're doing the best job we can. And that has been a motivation. So the party line is to advance research in metadata, semantics, and ontologies, and that is really information organization. Back to that who, what, where, when, how, or my question about, my elevator question about the best way to integrate automatic and human approaches. I study it more in sort of a metadata world, but to me it's all metadata information organization, and the questions and cut across different environments, not only data on the long tail. They do address big data, depending on how you define big data, or other digital text in the humanities and so forth. And just another motivator has been to create research opportunities for graduate students. We've had a lot of master's students engaged and doctoral students, and then visiting scholars from Egypt, Spain, Norway, Japan, and it's, you know, having them come and be on projects and interact with students. Just some pictures of two of the teams, and at the top is one of my metadata classes where I took them over to the Evolutionary Synthesis Center. A little data about the center. So we have had some nice grant funding. We've brought in about $14 million to UNC on collaborations, of which $4.25 million has gone directly to SILS. Part of national efforts, the NESCENT project, which has this synthesis center, so two rounds of funding from NSF. This is a $50 million in international funding through the Curator Excellence, and that was funded by Santander, the bank. It's a big bank in Spain, and you know, I didn't put the DataNet fundings up there, but part of those as well. In terms of students, I'd say over 30 students have done something substantial in terms of research, in whether it's a master's paper or a publication or you know, a dissertation. And the list there right now is the current student staff that's being supported. So I've got 3 people on full stipends, and then some hourly people, and 2 full-time staff. The Dryad Curator, we're actually in transition. We're going to make an offer when I get back to a new curator, because our other curator moved with her husband, and we have a senior researcher from computer programmer from IBM. And final slide. So I said I was using the word we, and you know, some of the work I presented and stuff I just mentioned really, you know, I have championed it, I guess, and led it and mentored students, but it really wouldn't have been possible without really the great work of students and collaborators at these various places. So I have the Metadata Research Center up there first, but NESCENT and my 2 chief collaborators are there, but there are others, are Todd Vision and Ryan Shirley. With the DataNet Federation Consortium, it's Regan Moore and Mike Conway and Joan Boone. Data One, Acknowledgement to John and Rebecca Koskela, and other collaborators up there. With the Hive, I'd like to just mention the vocabulary partners, the USGS, the Getty Research Institute, Library of Congress, the Food and Agriculture Organization, National Library of Medicine, National Agricultural Library, and the Unified Astronomy Thesaurus Initiative. And so all of these people have contributed in some way to work that I have shared with you here, or it's ongoing. So, okay. Well, thank you. And there were no interruptions. I hope I made you think about something, information organization or metadata-like, and open it up for some kinds of questions. So thank you.
Microphone here, and I'd like to, yeah, Michael.
I had a question about the value of metadata. The context in which you were talking suggested that this had to do with assessing of the probable utility of a data set you found. But historically, metadata would be more about finding it in the first place, like imagine using a library without a catalog. So what is the notion of the value depending on? I mean, in what sense?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, not just the value of the metadata associated with the finding, but my sense of value increasing over time is that it doesn't have to be reproduced each time. It's traveling with the resource and being reused over and over again. But I'm not sure I mean,
so it's more the utility in being able to inherit legacy metadata.
Inherit legacy metadata, reuse it, and then you could also, you know, so it's just getting started, but you could also enrich, you know, is there some value associated with enriching it?
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the value of metadata at all. Period.
Yeah. So thanks.
I like the idea of metadata capital, but I'm kind of puzzled by something because I'm tempted to use the cost basis as a way to start measuring it. And that seems that it would overvalue metadata produced by people, and presumably more expensive than that produced by machines. That's the first part of that. And secondly, if there is a notion of metadata capital, I should be able to measure it, for example, in seeing the impact that the papers that have data associated with them should have a higher impact, higher citations and so on than those which are not, because otherwise that data had no value.
Well, I think
Are you seeing
your
that
second
measure?
point is your second point is true, and you know, as I said, I have this little image with the smiley face sweating a little, and you know, am I in love with the concept and trying to make something fit? I sometimes ask myself, but I think that I had a great talk with John during lunch on this. There are costs associated with metadata, and I mean, and we tend to shy away from it because it's like futile. I mean, it's different in every world, and we try not to study it, you know. And so with this project, it's sort of to raise the profile of metadata and start to grapple with thinking about how we could study cost and the value of the metadata and how it could increase over time. And if we can get our head around it a little bit more, you know, I do think there's something to learn. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, but I mean, I know that,
yes.
for example,
Yeah.
we're required to have data management plans, and presumably you put budget to say
What's that?
what's
The second part?
the budget for a data management
Yeah.
plan when you're looking for a grant.
Yeah.
So
But,
I mean,
you're
presumably
supposed
that's
to put
going
that
to, is that related to this measure of metadata capital?
I have
What's
to
the
get together
cost
with my
to-
team.
to-
I think it could be. I think it could be, but it's, you know, the question is, where do you start to measure the cost? I mean, oh my
Precisely.
God. I mean, that's why I think it's futile. Is it the cost of, like, you know, I'm sitting here thinking about it. This is my time. I could be thinking about X, and I'm thinking about the cost of, you know, I'm thinking about the metadata I've got to create. Is that, you know, I mean, it's kind of scary to think about where you begin, but you know, I think we have to have a dialogue. I mean, there is. John asked me, you know, have I found anybody else studying this? Well, there are costs. There are cost studies and value of data. I mean, I could go back to, you know, there's these historical studies on the cost of cataloging. I can't really find good research on cost of metadata and where to begin. And I think, you know, I want to get people thinking about it.
I like it because I think, that, for example, it suggests the notion of depreciation and
Yeah.
things like that, which is then very much tied to some of the processes of data curation you want to have and so on. So I think I like it.
Well, thank you.
Well, just quickly follow up then. I think if you think about only the cost, that's only half of the story. Yeah, missing out on the value side of it, but the valuation side of it is going to be a lot more difficult as well. You mentioned
That relates back to what Michael was saying.
reuse, but I think
Yeah.
reuse is only one of many possible
Yeah.
dimensions along which you can try to quantify value, not only of metadata, but of data more generally. So-
Yeah, we get into those discussions with with the SGHI, the self-generated health information. Tom Caruso I'm working with. We get into these discussions every time I go in the office because we're trying to figure out to get our heads around it. And you know, are we really talking about the value of the data as opposed to the metadata? But this is that question you were asking me at lunch. What's the difference? And I mean, we can get really philosophical, but we're going to figure out something. We're going to move forward on, hopefully make a contribution to think about that. I mean, maybe metadata capital, you know, will become this uber concept of a way to think about it in all these ways we're saying. I don't know, but I have a year to push it forward and you know, sweat a little because I'm a little outside my element. But there is a professor in economics who is kind of a consultant to the project, and so. You know, he assures me I'm not totally off my rocker and moving forward. So, Marcy,
I'm taking chairs, Robin, and then I have Nick and then Marcy.
Okay.
Okay. So you've talked a lot about the value of metadata to scientists, and we understand that metadata came out of libraries and how the value that it serves there. We're a professional school that gets a lot of students who come and want to sort of start, you know, new ventures, new information services, develop new information systems. Right. And we have, this Friday, we have our New Admits Day. If you are one of the people that were speaking at the New Admits Day, what would you tell the students about why they need to learn about metadata? And this is not...
it's cliche. It's cliche. I mean, in the sense of data, but any kind of resource, I mean, the information content or your data is only as good as the metadata.
Right, but
you
can
want
you
more.
speak to them about, it's sort of abstract. Can you give an example of why it might be value for a student who's developing an information service, say? Many of these things exist in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to organize, you know, whatever, the information about
Well, it's gonna have,
my Fitbit organization.
Yeah. I don't know.
Why do they need to know it?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to get right at your question, but I mean, really, the impact on system effectiveness depends so much. And you know, people say they want to separate metadata from information retrieval. Well, you can't. I mean, maybe you can try to, but you know, your information retrieval activity can benefit from good quality metadata.
I totally get the value.
Yeah.
I'm
not sure I'm getting it.
Well, I think probably I would bring it down to a very clear. If you're defining a system and you're trying to develop your own system, you need to develop categories, and you need to have those kind of metadata to make your system work better. I'm just asking you to the guys who think they're starting the next Google.
It's a necessity. It's a must have.
Yeah. That's true. Right.
So, but I want to comment to one thing about your question. So, you know, metadata coming out of the library community. Actually, the term metadata was coined by the statistics community, and oh boy, I have the first utterance of it. I forget the guy's name. He's in Norway. He's part of what's this radical party in Norway, the Pirates or something. There's a political party. And I made contact with this guy, and he sent me copies of his dissertation. So I've actually done research on the history of the word metadata. You know, it was contested. One time it was registered. There was a trademark. There was a company, and all that. So I'm really, you know, I've drawn blank on his name, but a great guy. So who had the question next? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nick. I'm a PhD student here.
Thanks for coming.
I'm curious that maybe it's following up on a lot of the other questions. I really liked the sort of meta dictionary of people upvoting and downvoting. I mean,
that's great. We need researchers to work on it. John is right here.
Another way that we often look at that is through adoption. I work in W3C in some of the standards process, and sort of the life and death is always adoption. That's been a real struggle for the semantic web, for linked open data. Although these ideas have been around for decades, we're struggling to get widespread adoption. Do you have a sense that it seems like a lot of your projects are about decreasing the cost of getting good metadata, but do you have research on what are the barriers to adoption of these technologies?
So I think ease of use, you know, ease of use, and the thing about the meta dictionary is that it is user friendly. So I think that there are these learning curves, these barriers. I mean, people want to use a metadata standard and they go look at these registries and it's overwhelming and you can't tell which standard. I mean, I get calls, I'd say, you know, at least twice a month, you know, oh, I'm doing a project, can you tell me which metadata standard to use? I just, you know, go look somewhere else. But I mean, I think that there's so much information out there that it has to be simplified. And I think social networking hasn't been in any way exploited like it could be. So is that...
And is there any research on...
Oh, so the question, I'm sorry, you know. You know, I would be wrong to answer that now. You know, there's research, I mean, fully answer it because I haven't done extensive, I'm you know, sort of my gut and based on what I do know. But, you know, folksonomies and tagging is one area that there is quite a bit of research showing adoption and you know, more involvement of the masses. Although some of that research does show in the end there's really only a small percentage of people engaged in that. But it's beyond the sort of confines of people who traditionally want to get in and like really work with a standard. It has broadened it. So there is research in that area. In terms of the sort of, I can speak to the science community and some of the research that I said I have a long-standing relationship with NIEHS. So I did some work where we had scientists create metadata for their resources, and then we modified it and sent back information to them saying, you know, we've done something to your scientific data, metadata, and it was very interesting. You know, about 50% of those scientists said, don't change my metadata. You know, I don't want you to do it. Like there is a sense of ownership. So I mean, I have some evidence there. But I said when I say it would be wrong, I feel like, yeah, more research is needed. I mean, research to see what research has done. And maybe not even in this quite environment of information. You know, sometimes you got to, like, I use the analogy, you know, you got to look at, like, you know, cookbook indexing or something, look outside, but this idea of what's happening where people own or engage. And so, yeah, I like your question. So.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, time for a couple more questions, so Marcia and then, yes. Okay.
And Ray also had his hand up, although I'm scared of your question, Ray.
Wouldn't metadata capital involve value added so that you'd be able to calculate how difficult it would be to get at a particular data set if there were no metadata versus how easy it is to get to it when you do have the metadata?
I absolutely, I think so. This idea of enrichment so you could have no metadata, some metadata, you know, level 2, level 3 kind of thing, and where does that have impact? At this stage where we're just, you know, this comes up, and it actually, I think, relates to Michael's question. So yes, but I don't think that in this 1-year time we're going to get there. I think we can raise it, and I think it's really a type of capital.
Apropos of
yeah.
his question,
Yeah.
I would think being able to find it at all versus
Yeah.
not being able to
Yes.
find it
No
surely
metadata
can go
versus
into that
some
calculation.
Metadata. Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
well, it you know, it may play out. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
I imagine you
Yeah.
may not get real measurements of
Yeah.
the value of metadata
I know.
capital, but conceptual, I mean, social capital, nobody
Yeah.
can really measure it, but there's a conceptual
Yeah.
value in the term.
Right.
Okay, where
But
was that
I
going?
think you know, it is really, like you're saying, the foundation of, okay, no metadata versus some metadata is already an instance of capital. So, yeah. Thanks. All right.
I just wanted to challenge the idea that metadata, what's the value of metadata, and that the world is, Google included, is going to a metadata-free environment. There's a very mainstream way in which we're using metadata every day. Everyone who looks at a Google listing, you look at any item in your search results, it's actually structured. You could start to diagram what's in there, and you'll find little pieces of information that Google's algorithms have pulled out for your ability to make selection decisions. So it's not maybe it's an aspect, a facet of what we think of as metadata. It's very, very important for our selection and rejection decisions. It may not be going towards discovery, it's not created by these expensive means, but if you call it anything but metadata, that would seem wrong.
Yeah, well,
so
I agree with you.
It really is very mainstream.
It helps with evaluation of relevancy. So well, you're preaching to the choir.
Okay.
Thank you.
A last question from Ray.
Okay.
Comment and then a little question.
All right, Ray.
Of course, a lot of the metadata that Google uses is hidden, so you don't see it. What appears there on the first page wouldn't be there without the metadata of who's linking to who else.
Yeah. Right. It is right. It's identifier metadata. So, and using that in the algorithm.
The little question then is, I wondered about the date of your Norwegian metadata reference.
So it just happened this fall, where folks were interested in Hive. I want to say the guy's name is Olaf something. And so I put him in touch with Mike Conway, who's the programmer. Is there some relationship with your guys' work or something?
No. This was the term metadata.
When this guy when was it invented?
I have to look it up. I want to say 70 something.
Yeah.
I can look it up later and tell you. I mean, you can watch me search my computer because it's on there, but I don't know.
Cecilia Preston and I did some digging on this sometime back, and the earliest reference we could find was a paper by Dave Penniman and Wayne Dominic in ACES proceedings, where they talk about creating a database of databases, which would be a metadatabase, and describing all the contents of all the other databases within this database.
What is do you know your date?
I believe it was 76.
Yeah, I want to venture mine somewhere around 75, 76. So, but I am really happy to follow up with you on this. The information that I found was actually forwarded to me by Stuart Weibel initially, because he, Stuart Weibel is kind of the father of Dublin Core, and had shared it once with me, and then I contacted this guy, but he was pretty radical in saying it is his term. And I'm looking. Let's follow up because
we'll have to dig it up.
Yeah. So very good.
Thank you so much, Jay, for a great talk.
Well, thank you.